The opportunity AI gives us is to hyper-personalize.
The devil's in the detail, and the detail is actually the data.
Welcome to the MMC Ventures podcast. We're going beyond the hype in artificial intelligence. A warm welcome to listeners. I'm David Kellner, partner and head of research at MMC Ventures, the insight-led venture capital firm based in London. In this 6-part series, we'll be hearing deep insights from some of the world's leading AI technologists, entrepreneurs and corporate executives, while keeping things accessible for the non-specialist. I think AI is today's most important enabling technology, but it's not easy to separate fact from fiction. My goal for this series is for us to come away better informed about the reality of AI today, what's to come, and how to take advantage. I'm excited today to speak with Steven Roberts and Rob Otter from Barclays, two leaders driving change at the financial services organisation. It's a privilege to speak with Steve and Rob today to hear a buyer's perspective on AI, how corporates are thinking about, planning for, and responding to the opportunities and challenges posed by the age of AI. Steven is Barclays' Strategic Transformation Director. Steven leads a special team that works alongside key business areas, driving and executing transformation at Barclays so the business survives and indeed thrives in the digital revolution. As well as focusing on disruptive technologies, Steven has an emphasis on digital inclusion and supporting vulnerable groups. A natural scientist by training, Steven graduated from and received a PhD in geology and earth science from the University of Cambridge. Rob Otter is Managing Director and Head of Data Technologies and Applied Machine Learning with Barclays International. A data scientist by training, Rob helps Barclays develop the tools and techniques for advanced AI. Rob specialises in scientific computing and the engineering of high-performance computing and is a double technology fellow at Goldman Sachs and Credit Suisse. Steven, Rob, great pleasure to hear your perspectives today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's begin by establishing some context for your comments. Could you give me a sense of the scale of Barclays' operations, the number of people you touch, the breadth of services you provide?
Well, if I can speak about Barclays UK, which is the UK bank, about 24 million people in the UK have a relationship with us. About 16 million of those have a current account of some kind, and the rest will be Barclaycard customers only, or mortgage customers or savings customers only. So we employ in the UK about 24,000 people, and then indirectly employ people in India, the Philippines, who provide services to the UK bank. So typically call centres and some back office.
Interesting. It sounds like nearly half the UK population touches Barclays on a regular basis. Could you each then tell me a bit about your role? Maybe Rob, yours sounds particularly fascinating. Let's start with that.
Yeah, so I've been here under a year now, and I came here obviously with an investment banking pedigree. So coming into the retail world is a complete paradigm shift for me. My role is the standardization of data and the underlying technologies that the organization uses. So that could be payments data, that could be merchant data, all data with regard to credit card transactions or financial transactions, where that data is stored and how people can access that data. The other part of that is obviously leveraging insights from that data, and that's really where the machine learning comes from, where we're looking at fraud prevention and detection, but also revenue generation opportunities as well. Credit card impairment analysis as well in the US, where we're trying to predict when people may default on credit card payments. There's some interesting stories about that in relation to natural events such as hurricanes last year. Direct correlation between credit card defaults as well. So a lot of modelling that's going on there as well. So we have about 20 efforts at the moment with regard to machine learning we have active.
And Steven, strategic transformation at Barclays sounds like a pretty full remit. Could you tell us more about the role?
So I've been around a long time in the bank, so 27 years this year. And up until about 7 years ago, I was a very traditional operations and change person. So I was the chief operating officer for the bank in the UK. And when the new chief executive came and he said, help me with digital transformation, I had to go on a reinvention journey of my own, from managing large numbers of people without data, without digital, more by instinct than anything, to on my own start to learn new skills. The role that I created is one of almost being there to try and help the rest of the bank not get behind with things, and to make sure we keep ahead of things and to protect the bank about new things happening. And over the last 12 months, me having to learn about all this stuff called AI. I need to listen more and learn. I can give the business perspective, but not the AI perspective. So it's just a really, really interesting journey and a huge privilege to be able to learn new areas, really, that and then try and translate those so the business guys can understand the potential and the risks associated with these new things that are coming along.
Stephen, I suspect that journey you're describing is similar to a journey that a lot of other corporate executives are undertaking at the moment. So if we start just by exploring a bit your sense of big companies' awareness and understanding around AI. I mean, firstly, to what extent do you think corporate executives are aware of AI?
I think they're aware because they read in every single article, every single consultancy firm, everyone's pumping out AI is incredibly important. So they can't help but know that those two words are important. Whether they've got a clue at all about what that actually means, it feels a little bit like the early days of the internet, when people were being told about Yahoo and things and America Online and not really getting, and that wasn't because they were dumb, it's just they weren't getting what the potential could be and where it was going to go.
An email account.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think it's like that.
Sounds like the awareness is there because it's unavoidable at the moment.
Well, I think it is as well, but everything you touch these days is leveraging AI. I mean, from even the fridges you can buy these days to Netflix, recommendation engines, you're all using predictive analytics. So, if you have children, they're touching this stuff all the time and they're using technologies that we use, like GPUs on their Xboxes. So it's fully immersive now. And I think it's just sort of trying to understand the business outcome and how you can actually harness this sort of the power of this and actually make it applicable to any particular business unit. That's the secret, definitely.
Rob, from a technical perspective, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being zero understanding and 10 being really well informed, where do you think most corporate executives' understanding of AI is at?
That's going to be a varying figure, to be honest with you. I think it's in the mid-range. Okay. I think at the moment there's been a huge amount of hype around AI. A lot that's been generated, I think, from a lot of startup companies and so a lot of bigger companies as well that are obviously selling AI solutions as bolt-ons or machine learning solutions, for instance. A lot of senior people in the organization will understand how AI is applicable to them in the investment bank, for instance, or in the retail. We're seeing that here at Barclays across the spectrum of different business lines as well. But I think people are becoming more the devil's in the detail. I think that's the main thing here, and how you approach things. And the detail is actually the data, how you get your data, and how you actually get those interesting facts from your data and make it relevant for your machine learning and data scientists. It's improving here, definitely. I'd say it's between a 5 and a 7 here. But I think across the industry, there are certain areas I think Barclays where we are behind, but certain areas I think we are leap years ahead of other organisations.
We believe from our research that financial services is at the leading edge of AI adoption and understanding relative to a lot of other sectors. Do you share that perspective, or do you have a different view?
I think the biggest catalyst that triggered a lot of the AI and ML work around the city was the FX LIBOR manipulation and unauthorized trading events, where firms wanted to understand how they could target or basically develop what we call pattern of life analysis for the traders. So looking at unusual trades, unusual trading volumes, unusual trading patterns, but also trying to predict that behavior. So really in the last sort of 5 years, there's been a huge explosion, especially with the investment bank and control room, where they're looking at technologies to basically assist first line of defense, second line of defense, and control room as well, and compliance. So that's been a big springboard for sort of ML and AI there, definitely. Sort of semi-supervised models.
To Rob's point, because I think it's a really important one about how pervasive it is. But it feels in a way that without people understanding the risks associated with that. And those are now emerging. When X-rays were first discovered and everyone thought, this is flipping incredible. And then, of course, people started realizing the risks associated with that. And some of those are emerging. So the stuff with the fake news and the manipulation of Facebook and things like that. And I think, so there's an awareness, but it's a superficial awareness. There's an awareness in people like Rob, which is deep, but at the C level. I think if you were to give them a very simple test on what do these things mean, then I think very few of them would pass. And especially if you said to them, and so what would be the associated risks of these? People often see the upsides, but not some of the dangers. So that's what's interesting. Having been around a long time, I could very easily see a mis-selling claim in 5 years' time that looks back and says, hang on, you've been giving out loans to this group of people, but overdrafts to this group and credit cards to this other group. What's your justification for that? And why did that happen?
It sounds like you're saying that understanding is fairly weak and pretty variable, but what people are certainly not understanding is any of these kinds of risks or challenges.
Got a perfect example of that. In the old days, you may have a nice two-dimensional graph, okay, and you've got a correlation between ice cream sales and the weather, whatever. Now, the sort of models we're dealing with are, well, good grief, up to, say, 500 columns, multi-dimensional, 50 dimensions of data. We're having to use specialized hardware. And the model training and the predictions take anything up to, say, 15 hours. So, once that model is completed, you've then got a prediction. And you then look at things, say, for instance, if a transaction is fraudulent or non-fraudulent. Now, to that point made earlier, if those models are incorrect and you're now using that model in a live system and now people's credit cards are being declined or merchants' reports are incorrect, you've now got a bit of evidence and trace all the way back through, say, a neural network how you derived that conclusion. And that is a very difficult thing to do because a neural network is very much like the brain. It's a connection of axons and dendrites and neurons. And we model very complicated neural networks to do these things. So we are working on evidencing AI, but it's not an easy solution. I think that's the one thing, to back up Steve's point, that needs to be cracked in the next 12 months. Otherwise, I think what will start to happen in the financial services sector and other areas, it has to happen. You have to be able to back up what the model is basically inferring. I suppose how some firms get around this is it's what I call semi-supervised. Even though the model is providing a recommendation, there is still a human there to potentially triage that decision. However, with a credit card transaction, you don't have that. It's either declined or it's approved.
It sounds like both the biggest barrier and the biggest opportunity in AI for financial services in the next year ahead is going to be this challenge of explainability.
Explainability and data privacy as well. Yeah. Obviously, we're dealing with very sensitive data and, not wishing to tone down what the medical areas are doing. That's extremely sensitive data there. But we're dealing with demographic data, people's social security numbers, could be absolutely anything in this data that can be used, obviously, to mine some very interesting information and form some very interesting predictions. But, of course, the control of that data, who has access to that data, and the derivatives of that data, and how that lineage and provenance is controlled through the process of looking at that data to actually creating a machine learning model, has to be absolutely locked down in a controlled aspect. Otherwise, the first example of something happening where we have a data breach with machine learning could be the end of sort of machine learning in an organization. All the controls and checks and balances will come down and potentially extinguish the sort of good work I think that could come from that.
Stephen, you mentioned C-level and how they're thinking about this. Is your sense that AI adoption is being driven kind of top-down in most organizations, or is it more from lines of business up? Who's driving the AI change?
I think it's coming from both. I think in the beginning it came from the business lines, but I think that the people C and above are getting it more and more. I think they can't help but get it just because there's so much noise out there and the stakeholders they speak to are all talking about it. And when they go to Davos and places, it occupies 60% of the conversation things. I mean, that they've got to take note of it, and they're seeing things from within the organization. I'm not sure, it's almost they're catching up, because what's happened is that, as Rob says, the organization has been using this stuff for years. They might not have called it AI, but actually they might look a bit primitive now, but it's much the same, and it's the same people.
Should we talk a bit about AI strategy? Because I'm fascinated to hear how, as a big buyer, you even approach this area. So today banks have a very broad range of both opportunities and challenges. You've got tougher regulation, you've got newer challenger banks, but opportunities like the rise of smartphones and then new initiatives like cryptocurrencies and more. How far up the agenda, firstly, is exploring AI, given how much you have on your plate as a bank?
From top of house, it's very high on the agenda at the moment, from both a detection of fraud, reducing potential impairment, 2, starting to look at reducing contact center exposure. So using things like natural language processing, optical character recognition. So taking the written word, putting it into something that an algorithm can understand. There is a huge push at the moment for a lot of those different initiatives. We're working on quite a few of those as well at the moment. Obviously, fraud detection is one. Revenue generation is the other as well, targeting obviously different customers. But definitely coming from top of house across the organisation. I mean, Stephen's probably got other examples of that. But most of the big projects at the moment are looking to leverage some aspect of artificial intelligence that I'm dealing with at the moment.
Right.
Even we're doing sort of facial recognition. I think the other thing is it's which comes first. So a lot of the projects we're doing, we're not necessarily waiting for the business to come to us with a requirement. We'll sort of build a product that we can actually sell to the business. So like a natural language processing engine or an inference or sentiment analysis engine, very important. So for instance, if you have people writing notes down or putting different information that people may be emailing the organization, is it positive or negative sentiment? You can then use that against news feeds, for instance. Any natural language engine could be used against any type of data. You could use it in the investment bank, for instance, to look at emails, to look at sentiment within emails. Is it, potentially fraudulent communications occurring there? Is it sort of sexist or racist, so to speak? You can start to be very, very powerful by developing these very simple modules that can be put into different parts of the organisation. So we're also working on that from a more central standpoint as well.
Do you have an AI strategy?
AI strategy with regard to data, the platform it resides on, the tools, techniques that we're using, and the underlying hardware or scientific compute platform, yes, we do. The firm has something called transaction cycles, which are main initiatives that run across the whole organisation, such as fraud, contact centre, merchant services. There are a whole load of those things. And we've developed that platform to be used specifically for those transaction cycles. So in the case of fraud, for instance, we have a platform where we will be putting the golden source of data onto a Hadoop platform, then performing our feature engineering, which is basically just letting the business analysts and the data scientists understand really the highly correlated fields within the data, but sort of sitting down with the business and saying, okay, what sort of questions do you want to ask of the data? What do you want to determine? Is it basically just binary? Is that fraudulent or not? Or is it more like a linear sort of question to want to ask for the data? And then we've got the platform, which is for training these vast amounts of data, multidimensional sets of data. We have a sort of supercomputer, a liquid cooled supercomputer we use for that. Because the paradigm is very different now. Time to compute is the most precious thing. So when I'm paying for very expensive individuals, data scientists or machine learning experts or graph experts, I don't want them waiting 15 hours for a model to run, then to determine, okay, perhaps that's not the correct model for that. We need to tweak it. So the quicker I can iterate and pivot through my model development, the quicker I can get it to production. So that's why we use highly optimized hardware to do that, and highly optimized libraries that we actually develop the APIs that sit on top of those as well.
You don't use predominantly the cloud-based platforms available from what we call the game vendors, Google, Amazon, IBM,
Yes.
Microsoft. Do they just not offer a level of control and capability that you would like for the level at which you're operating?
I would say the answer is they do. If you look at Google, they went from GPUs to TPUs, which is their own, obviously, developed hardware platform. And that's, I think, AWS also supports NVIDIA GPUs as well. The main thing is around data. So obviously at the moment, moving sensitive data either geographically or intra-regionally, even out to a cloud, there will have to be various dispensations. Now, the firm is looking at those things at the moment. Obviously, we would love to go to the cloud. And it's an interesting paradigm shift now. In the old days of Hadoop, you had lots of pizza box servers in the data center, wired together with networking switches, consuming large amounts of power. You may have a 48 or a 64 node cluster. And you'd use technologies, potentially open source technologies such as Spark or standard MapReduce to perform a lot of those things. Now what we're seeing is a difference in that, where we've now got a supercomputer that is equivalent of 120 servers that sits in half a cabinet, uses less power, and actually is able to compute these things in a fraction of the time. So cloud, yes, absolutely. But I think, where we are with our model development is on the right-hand side of sort of data science, building sort of very deep neural networks, very interesting introspective problems that require high compute. There is also the traditional data science route, which is sort of looking at things like clustering or behavioral analytics that may use sort of standard modeling techniques such as classification or linear regression that may not need those sort of far right types of optimized hardware. And that's, I think, where cloud will play a huge part in the organization.
There's an interesting tension in what you've described, that clearly you're big users of deep learning, of neural networks. You've got the hardware to accelerate that. You've got the use cases for it. At the same time, it sounds like one of the biggest inhibitors for you is the challenge of explainability.
Yes.
And obviously neural networks struggle with that. How do you think about that that
So
kind of challenge?
we're working with an internal organisation within the firm. Sort of any model now that's being developed has to go through various checks and balances to make sure the approach, the source code, everything has gone through the various diligent processes. And this is also something that's very new to the firm. We've taken through a very simple linear regression model for this process. We've never taken through a recurrent neural network through this process, which, as you may not know, is very, very different. Completely. So that's early days. However, we are working with some West Coast companies that have developed systems that allow you to evidence the outcome of your models and explain it from a neural network standpoint. So that's really our Q1, Q2 initiative for this year, in parallel with what we're doing with the models and the other sort of scientific compute platforms, is to make sure that we can actually describe these things.
So you're trying to have your cake and eat it, which is leverage the capability of neural networks, but crack the explainability problem through a combination of software and process.
Yeah. So what I've done in the meantime is, even though we developed most of our models on a neural network concept, we've also developed our models in parallel on things such as tree-based models or random forest, or in this case, gradient boosting models, where the explainability is a lot easier. So we've sort of gone down both paths with this. Even though we get better precision and recall with neural network, marginally, in some cases, we're using gradient boosting as well.
Stephen, it's striking to me that the level of ambition you have here, the capabilities required, and the process change demanded are far beyond the day-to-day. How do you help reposition the bank to support this kind of level of thinking and working?
My number one priority is to try and get as many people in the bank understand at least 60 to 70% of what Rob has just talked about, and not just understand it, but think about the potential, what it can offer, and the risk around it. So we've set ourselves what seems like a crazy ambition about making Barclays employees the most AI savvy of any large company. And that's the ambition. Now, we've got to go from a huge low base to get to that. But we did the same thing with digital savviness 7 years ago when we started. So, but unless we have that huge ambition, we won't get there. And the sort of proof points that we want will be around us making the right decisions and the right buying decisions, the right decisions around models that we deploy and that we're not seeing redress in years to come, and the excitement of the people within the organisation, and so the people we can attract. The thing that's always interested me over the last 12 months, when I've been talking to the data scientists, and I asked them what have they done before, and unlike Rob that had worked in financial services for, a load of them worked in what I thought were really, really interesting things, like really interesting organisations doing really interesting stuff. Because you have to admit, I mean, even though I enjoy it, a lot of banking is quite boring. And when I said to these people, why have you come here to work in Barclays? And they said, it's obvious, it's the data.
That's their oxygen.
And that's their oxygen. It's and you start realising the personalities of a lot of the people in this field. Their oxygen is exactly the right word. And I thought, blimey, this is incredible. So we have some assets here in terms of our data that we should be a very attractive place to come to work. We don't really advertise that, and we don't get out there with the universities and the people where we should be. And part of doing this podcast with yourself is part of that, is saying, actually, we've got some good stuff here and we're very thoughtful. So the other thing that, whilst Rob is putting in place all of the transparency, we've spent over the last couple of months being quite thoughtful around what ethical standards we put in place around the deployment of AI, which would include that transparency. So we've been gathering up all of the ethical standards that all the great and good have been creating around the world, and pulling out what we think are the common bits and the best bits. And we're on, I can't remember which version is at the moment, that we're just circulating around people to say, how do these feel? It's that thoughtfulness. We want to be engaged with all of the different bodies, whether the government bodies or the Nuffield Foundation or the Turing Institute, and say, we want to be part. This is not the job of a load of IT companies. to decide. That they're just supplying some of the tools in this process. It should engage with the people who are managing the outcomes and the real people beyond. And so we have a societal reason that we need to engage deeply in this. I genuinely believe that.
What struck me listening to you was that there are clearly so many use cases where this can be applied. It touches virtually every aspect of the bank. Do you then, in terms of strategy, tend to think of AI as an enabling technology, and you think about how do we have an AI strategy for across the business, or do you tend to think more from a use case basis?
Well, I think it's at different levels. So Rob has talked about how technically, how do you, the tools that you use and standardization, and whether you use cloud services for some applications and internal services for others. At a bigger level, the priority at the moment seems to me to be rapidly get intelligent buyers and users of the services. Because it's an educational thing. I think it is quite comparable to the early days of something like radiation, when people can see a lot of very positive things, but they don't know what the heck it is and what are the dangers associated with it. So before you even decide how you're going to deploy it, we should be just getting people so they're intelligent in how they use this wonder tool. I mean, it is a wonder that the more that I've read, the more I've thought this truly is something in the history of mankind that has huge potential implications, definitely for the bank, but for everybody. And so there's a bit of a, God, we've got to quickly learn how to drive.
We've been discussing AI strategy. Stephen, what single piece of advice would you give to a corporate executive who wants to engage with AI but just doesn't know where to start?
It's education, education, education. So that leader needs to educate themselves to understand what AI is about, what it means, what the risks are around it, what are the things they should be thinking around in terms of ethics. I think the biggest risk to the organisation is us being dumb buyers.
I'd add to that point actually as well. I think one of the key things is eliminate all the fodder. You know, there'll be PowerPoints that people are going to show you. What I'd recommend any senior person in an organisation is go and sit with a data scientist and say, okay, here's some of my personal data, or whatever it could be. Okay, look, there's two classic data sets that every data scientist is probably trained on. One is the Iris data set, and one is the Titanic data set, where you basically go through those data sets and you predict who's going to live or die on the Titanic. Okay. However, it uses some very fundamental tenets of data science. And that's something that a senior executive will be able to understand, sort of smell and feel. And that's very important to go through the mechanics of that. It's not very complicated, but sort of go through the process and the stages of those things. Have that person explain to you really what this is all about. You know, how we're trying to predict something from a known outcome. That's the big thing is with supervised learning is you've got a data set where you have a known outcome. You already know the people. For instance, on the Titanic, for instance, women in first class or children had a higher probability of living than the men in third class. And if you look at the Titanic data set, you've got one field in there, which is called a classifier, which is a 1 or a 0, which means did you live or die? All you do is you cut that data in half, you put one set of that data through the model, and then you put the other set of data, the blind set of data, without the 1s and 0s or who was died, through the same model, and it predicts who lived or died. And based upon that accuracy percentage, because you've now got, you know the outcome, you may get 99, 98%. So when all these execs hear people going about precision recall, confusion matrices and all that, they can then break that down to, okay, I now understand very fundamentally what really happened here. Okay, because that data set had a known system of truth in it. And all I've done is I've removed some of that from that data and I've trained a model. And that's really what we're doing with fraud as well. We know there are patterns when people have committed fraud, so the model remembers that. Next time we see a similar pattern, we then have a probability that that may be a fraud, and it's a probability.
Bring this closer to home. Could you describe for me 2 or 3 of the use cases to which you're applying AI today?
Absolutely. So obviously the biggest one really is fraud. In the case of sort of credit card fraud, big merchant fraud, where we have particular merchants that could be committing fraud on behalf of customers, and obviously when people come in to pay for something, being able to detect if that card is stolen. There's a fraudulent instance there. So you're looking at multiple different data sets there to try and look at patterns. The very interesting one is impairment analysis, which you're doing for the US, which is, in essence, we probably all did this when we were teenagers. You've got a credit card and your bill comes in and you've got a choice. You either pay the whole bill off or you don't pay anything off, or you pay the minimum payment. And probably as students, we all didn't do anything about it.
So fraud prevention, impairment prediction.
Yeah, the two are sort of fairly coupled as well. Obviously, yes. The full transaction cycle, we're looking at obviously building our own system, and we have incumbent vendors in-house. So we're looking at sort of building the models that will work with parallel with the vendors. And then hopefully at some point in the future, we can replace the incumbents with our own IP and our own models.
And Stephen, in conversations you and I have had previously today, I think you've mentioned to me kind of customer service and augmentation around that. I'd love to learn a little more about your thinking there. Where do you see the opportunities?
So one of the interesting things to me that AI enables us to unlock is personalization. So over history, what's happened is that if you go back, and a nice analogy for me is in medicine. So before the Industrial Revolution, if you had enough money, then the medicines that were created for you were hyper-personalized. So they looked at your body weight, your height, and a physician would make up a file of medicine just for you. With mass production, you got tablets that were one size. And so the medicines you were given were, you either had 1 tablet or 2 tablets. So the degree to which you could personalize, you were one of 5 types, say, treated for a particular disease. And we've done exactly the same. So when banking was bespoke, probably up until the 1950s, you'd see the bank manager and you'd get a very personal service. What happened with, in our case, computerization was that we did, whilst we were able to bank almost the whole population, it meant that you got one of 5 risk models, for example. And we introduced things like credit scores. And you were in a particular range, and if you had a range between this and this, you got one, that this was the product you got. the opportunity AI gives us is to hyper-personalize.
Can I just pick on that? I mean, it's a fascinating and profound point you made that banking through AI could come full circle back to an era of you and your bank manager, but now that bank manager is digital.
Now that in itself has a really interesting thing that we've discovered through some work that I and a colleague have been doing. So when we provide information to customers at the moment, it's necessarily generic because we don't know who the person is. And in the digital environment, it's completely generic. So everybody gets to see the same web page and the same web pages. Now, increasingly, we will be able to present web pages that are very specific to that customer. Beyond their transaction information, we'll know what things they're especially interested in. Now, as you become more and more specific to the customer, you start moving into, in financial services, that you're giving advice. And that has all sorts of implications and protections that you will have to put in place and be very thoughtful around. Even though it's information, because it's personalized information, the boundary between what's advice and giving information starts blurring. And we've realized that through some work we've been doing. And I don't think the regulation has kept up with that personally, having read or been reading through that. So that's another one of the interesting challenges we're facing.
What do you think the kind of second order consequences would be of a move back to a personalised banking experience? Well, let's fast forward 20 years and I'm engaging completely personalised interaction with my bank. What impact will that have on competitive landscape, on people's notion of banking?
So banking is boring to customers. So they don't want to really engage with the bank manager unless some life thing happens, like they need to buy a house or a relative dies or something like that. So I think the opportunity AI gives is to make it even more invisible. So people don't need to keep going into their mobile banking app 20 times a day to check whether a payment has come in or not. They don't need to be checking whether they need to send a rental payment or a mortgage payment or whether a direct debit has happened. All of these things are left from the 1970s. The AI will give the ability to just manage that seamlessly, as though a private banker would do at the moment, so that you're not hassled or bothered. It'll make it more like electricity.
Can we talk a bit about deploying AI, and in particular build versus buy? So to take advantage of AI, do you tend to engage with third-party software and service providers or build in sort of in-house teams or a combination? I mean, obviously some of the elements you've described already sound pretty bleeding edge in-house. But how do you go about thinking about that build versus buy decision? What are the pros and cons?
So the pros of obviously that is I can control the acceleration. I'm not reliant on a vendor. So I have a new release that's going to support something. So we build our models using a low-level library called Tensor or TensorFlow, which is really what
which is the Google open source library.
Absolutely, yeah. We may have Keras or MXNet on top of that, but it's the tensors that drive neural networks on top of the GPUs.
If and at what point do you look to involve third-party AI-led application providers, whether it's for fraud or impairment forecasting? Or at that level, how do you decide whether to do that in-house or leverage third parties?
We have that. We've inherited that, basically. So we have a few technology companies in-house already that are doing things like fraud detection, for instance. And I think one of the big efforts at the moment is potential dissatisfaction with some of those vendors, but also looking at having a bit of conviction within ourselves and seeing if we can actually do it ourselves and save a bit of money, but also retain the IP as well. So there's some of the big drivers there. But we do, and most organizations on the street will either have, SaaS fraud capability in there, or Palantir, or lots of other companies at the moment. All these companies actually have sort of spun out from the CIA and the NSA as well. Like you look at Red Owl, Palantir, quite a few of them sort of came out of there probably 2009, 2010 era.
What's the biggest challenge you face when deploying AI?
The fact that the firm doesn't understand it, really. You've got this doomsday weapon in a Java object that's looking at a transaction flow and making a decision in real time on something or advising on a probability. Now, that Java object is just a small component, potentially, in what we're building for fraud. There are gateways in there, there's decision engines, there's other types of rules engines that augment the outcome of just what the model is recommending. Emphasis on recommending there. So it's building a whole ecosystem for that. And I think the firm's quite immature at that at the moment. I think we've discussed the evidencing the AI is the other thing. And just how we support that. Because remember, once I have that model deployed, I've then got to keep retraining on new data. So the data set expands, then that model then gets instantiated back into Java again. So all that whole process and pipeline, I think, has to be hardened. I think, we've got this, we've built it, but we're now looking to deploy in production and making sure we go through the necessary steps for how we roll it back, how we roll it forward, for instance, different support issues we may encounter as well.
And Stephen, from your perspective, the kind of biggest challenge in deploying AI as you see it in the organisation?
It's what Rob said, but it's interesting. He described how it integrates with the rest of it. And there's a project that we've been doing with an executive of the bank who left and set up a company. He's creating an AI-based application, and we've been wanting to understand how that works. And you end up having to draw exactly the picture that Rob was just discussing. And in doing that, I was thinking at the time when we were drawing all this out, my God, what a nightmare this would be inside the bank trying to do this.
One question for each of you. What surprised you most through this AI journey and trying to deploy AI?
It shouldn't be a surprise, but it still is a surprise. It's the overhype and the oversell. And that's from the outside, and the lack of knowledge inside the bank. From a business perspective, the most interesting companies I've seen have been the most focused ones. So the ones that are solving a very specific problem, and they tend to be business people who've learned how to do AI or learned how to recruit good people, rather than a bunch of clever AI people who wander around saying, I can solve anything.
How can AI startups engage more effectively with big buyers like yourselves?
So we're based in Shoreditch, which is our RISE office, and we've got a permanent office space there, and we're constantly interacting with some of the other startups there that may be using AI. And there's a little community with data science as well. You'll tend to meet them in video conferences or whatever else like that. So it also helps from an innovation standpoint, just keep track of who's new on the block, or who's developing some new things as well, or who's perhaps. You can see this stuff on Kaggle as well. You can start to see who's contributing to some of the Kaggle prizes and things. So there's lots of different avenues to determine sort of who's hot and who's not in this space as well. From a surprise standpoint, it's actually a positive surprise for me. Since I came here, I literally just stipulated what I wanted. And going back to the one important thing there, luckily I'm in charge of a data team as well as a data science team. So I have the data. So I have the oxygen that my guys need. But I also was able to buy the underlying technologies that they've been used to. That's the other thing as well. We've been recruiting a lot of data folks or machine learning people. And I've not had it, but I know people have had it, where they've actually just refused a job because the platform they've been offered to work on is just not good enough for them. They've not got servers, they've not got potential GPUs or whatever. They've been given perhaps a laptop with no defined requirements. So these guys are quite fair weathered as well. So you have to make sure you have a good structure within your group. And I won't use the word toys, but you have to have the right underlying technologies that can really, you get your money's worth out of these people.
Just thinking about the startup piece, what kind of single biggest mistake or mispositioning do you see startups making when they try to engage with your suppliers? Like, what one message would you like to get out there to startups that would make them more successful when pitching to a big bank? Not
just startups, some of the bigger organizations is, if you're coming into pitch to a group of individuals that really understand the underlying technology, don't try and masquerade a load of open source solutions as your own solution, okay? Because people see through that very quickly and say, okay, well, you did that with that, didn't you? And you've put a little wrapper around it and called it your own. So I think really look at the innovation and sort of talk about how you're potentially driving that community from an Apache project standpoint. What's the killer app? What are you doing that's so different that we can't get today with all the other stuff that's available for us to sort of download from a lot of different organizations as well. That would be my recommendation there.
And how do you successfully attract talent when you're competing against both Facebook, etc., and AI startups?
Really with what I just said.
Yeah.
But also, without wishing to sound arrogant, most data scientists teams or machine learning teams fail because the person in charge of them isn't hands-on. And you need to keep these guys accountable. You need to be able to interact with them in a way where they can discuss their problems or their challenges, but really get into the details of that. So from my standpoint, I'm as detailed as my guys from a neural network standpoint or whatever. So that relationship is very key. Because I understand what their problems or their challenges may be from day one. So I think that's an important point. And that's where I've seen most machine learning teams fail is they've either put somebody in there in charge who's like a sort of non-technical person, but also, like I said, not provide the data or the underlying technologies for them to use.
One slightly more technical question. I mean, possessing lots of training data usually enables AI algorithms to deliver better results. As a big company, I mean, huge data sets should be a big advantage that Barclays has.
Yeah.
But does the fragmented and siloed nature of that data mean, in reality, your ability to harness it is more limited?
Yes, it is. And firm-wide, we're going through a sort of top-of-house review of all the Hadoop clusters we have in the organisation and where the data is. But we're also looking at, from a data standpoint, understanding what our critical data elements are and what the architectural target state should be for where these critical data elements reside. Obviously, the outcome, theoretically speaking, will be better, depending on how you feature engineer that. So we do have examples of where we're trying to obviously converge data into a single platform, and then obviously control the derivatives of that data as well. But there's a challenge in all institutions, because I don't know any organisation that's just got one Hadoop cluster, for instance, that I've worked in anywhere else.
Where do you see the biggest opportunities for AI startups to address a need you have, either at the kind of tooling and process layer or at the application layer?
I think tooling and process. I think, at the moment, a lot of things are very hand-cranked, from feature engineering through to obviously model training to, if you look at model deployment, for instance. So there's definitely how we automate that whole process is good. I think the big wide hole is obviously evidencing the AI. So there's a few, like I mentioned, startups that look at that. The other one is hyperparameter tuning. When we're running a model, for instance, we do various things. We split the different data sets up using different type of folding algorithms into our training model. But then just taking a very simple model, there could be 100 different combinations of different tuning parameters that we could use to get better fidelity. So those things take absolutely hours. So automating that would be a really cool thing as well. And there are ways of doing that.
For large companies, how will competitive success factors change in the age of AI, do you think?
From an investment banking standpoint, I suppose there's multiple ways you can use artificial intelligence for predictive purposes. It's just like a standard quant model. You've now got a lot more accessibility to libraries, lower-level libraries. I mentioned the tensors, the GPUs as well. So I think it will provide a competitive advantage for being able to predict certain behaviours and volatilities. That being said, there are pretty good models out there already that do this. We've seen that. I think the ability to sort of look at targeting high net worth clients, the ability to detect unusual patterns in trading behaviour as well, so eliminating loss or fraudulent behaviour is a big thing. Unauthorised trading is a huge thing at the moment. If you look at the number of people in compliance teams, first line of defence, second line of defence, that are all looking at unusual patterns in trading, there could be a reduction in staffing levels there by using things like AI. Control room, supervisory intelligence units, majority of big organisations from Goldman's, JP Morgan have these SIUs now, which is augmented by AI type of technologies, which are providing recommendations on certain behavioural patterns they may be seeing in certain trading patterns from individuals. There's a whole plethora of things there.
Do you think that today banks really are just technology companies that happen to do banking?
That is a real tricky question, and I'll answer very straight. I've worked, obviously, for the big bank that did say, Don Duet, who was the CTO of Goldman Sachs, and Sherman Horn, they said Goldman Sachs is a technology organisation. And it truly was. I mean, you would not get a vendor technology in through the door. There had to be a reason why you couldn't build it yourself. That really was the way in. I think a lot of organisations, and obviously Goldman's has changed over time, a lot of organisations do claim that, but don't really practice what they preach. At the heart of every big banking institution, there has to be a solid spine of technology. It goes without saying. But it's really how that bank is able to, as a single unit, innovate and move in one direction very quickly. But also, what really makes a technology organisation is incubating an idea, building it, but then selling it to other people. We've seen that from a few big organisations. I'm not going to name names. How they've sort of created spin-offs, the groups of individuals from that organisation who's gone off and formed their own company. They're the signs of a technology organisation, in my opinion, where you're able to sort of take a concept, build it yourself, and then either sell it to the marketplace as well. So I think everybody likes to think they're a technology organisation, but there are parts of it, and there are parts where it doesn't exist, I think.
Just finally, how do you think banking will look different in 10 to 15 years as a result of AI?
We had the low latency explosion in 2006 to 2008 before the market crashed. Everyone was trying to do things quicker. And there was a whole explosion of Verilog programs. And that sort of went away. I don't think, I see this as another tradecraft that's going to aid the investment banking or the banking world. And I think once the excitement's over, it will just be, like I said, another tradecraft that we're using to enable us to basically make us more stable, more profitable, and align ourselves with the regulatory patterns we're seeing. You're not going to see huge reductions in staff, but it's, like I said, it's an augmentation technology where it will help people do their jobs better. It will help people form recommendations or opinions, especially from a sales standpoint or from a fraudulent standpoint. It will stop false positives. That's the main thing. We don't want to be accusing people of doing things they haven't done. So these sort of technologies will aid that.
Let's finish today with our quick fire round, if I may. Just 1 or 2 word answers, please. A few questions I'll fire your way. Firstly, is the promise of AI overhyped?
No.
I'd say no as well.
In which sector do you think AI will have the most profound impact?
Cars, planes, transport.
Everything. I don't think there's one.
Do you think AI will overall destroy more jobs than it creates?
Yes.
Potentially, but I think it's an augmentation technology.
Should we worry a lot about autonomous weapon systems?
Yes.
Any autonomous system, I think we should be worried about.
Do you think we'll achieve an AI singularity this time when general AI triggers a period of unprecedented technological change? And if so, when?
I don't know.
That's a tough one to answer. Things are moving so quickly with AI. More than 2 words, sorry.
And finally, do you think AI systems of sufficient intelligence should have rights?
No.
No.
John, thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of MMC Ventures Beyond the Hype podcast, presented in association with Barclays. Follow us on Twitter at MMC_Ventures and explore our research at mmcventures.com. Don't miss our next episode, Transforming Technology, where Dr. Janet Basterman, Chief Science Officer at StoryStream, provides an accessible introduction to the state of AI technology, describes the limitations of the technology today and how it will evolve, and how companies can build effective AI teams and products.
I think the biggest challenge with AI is transference learning. We don't have that adaptability yet.